We continue tonight to where we left off this morning in our discussion of this matter of abortion. And as I did this morning, I want to begin with an introduction that sort of defines the problem as we face it. I approached it somewhat statistically this morning, and tonight I'd like to approach it somewhat from an ethical viewpoint. And let me just share with you some thoughts that may help to set this thing in your mind, and then we'll go to the Word of God for specific answers. For centuries, the Western world has operated on what we could call a sanctity of life ethic. That is to say, a person had a right to life simply because he was human, and was considered human because he was alive. But there has been a shift in recent years toward a quality of life ethic rather than a sanctity of life ethic. This new ethic basically says a person doesn't have a right to live simply because he's human. A person only has a right to live if he meets certain criteria, certain qualities. According to that new modern viewpoint, a person has no rights simply because he is alive. Even if he is physically alive, he must meet some additional criteria for being fully human. If he fails to meet the criteria, he doesn't have the rights of a human, including the right to live. The unborn must meet some kind of a vague standard of genetic worthiness, or they must have a life worth living, or they must be wanted by society, or they must meet the mother's personal criteria to be considered human. This shift subtly allows for the nightmarish scenarios of utopias gone awry, as well as the kind of genetic purification programs that were pursued by Hitler and the Nazi doctors. The same kind of ethic allowed the Nazis to try to weed out unwanted genetic elements in the population. When one Nazi death camp guard was asked how he could exterminate thousands of people, his reply was that they were not regarded as human. And the parallel to our modern situation is uncomfortably close. According to a number of researchers, Margaret Sanger, who, by the way, is the founder of Planned Parenthood, the world's largest supporter of abortion, according to the researchers who study her, she essentially agreed with Hitler's approach and sought to weed from the human race blacks, Southern Europeans, Hebrews, and other, quote, feeble-minded. She regarded abortion as a part of a genetic improvement program for the human race. This then moves us from a sanctity of life to a quality of life right to live, and that quality of life is to be determined by the genetic engineers or the philosophers or whoever. Although shocking, these eugenic proposals are not very different in principle from the present practice of aborting babies for any reason at all. A baby who has Down syndrome, a baby who has some other birth defect, or a baby who would be an inconvenience, doesn't have a life worth living, therefore isn't human, therefore we can dispose of them readily. Respected scholars have already proposed different criteria for this quality of life, and you can read endlessly on this. One illustration, Nobel laureate James Watson proposed that a person not be declared having the quality to live until 3 days after birth to be sure he's healthy. In other words, wait 3 days, and then if the child doesn't meet the criteria, take its life. Other proposals would require that someone be several years old before he could be considered a human and thus qualified to live. And I heard recently that in some Scandinavian countries they are now saying a person may not be truly considered to be human until they are 7 years old. Of course, if criteria can be imposed near the beginning of life, then it can be imposed at any time in life. Joseph Fletcher, you associate him with situation ethics, suggested that to be considered a person, one must have a measurable IQ of at least 40. Infants would not qualify, nor would the aged who are senile, nor would others who had certain types of accidents. In such cases, argues Fletcher, abortion, infanticide, and euthanasia are not taking personal life, but merely biological life. Attempts to justify abortion by claiming it eliminates suffering not only forsakes the sanctity of life ethic, but also ignores the facts. Some people say to do this will eliminate suffering. That's not true. It's like the argument that the handicapped don't have a life worth living. That there's validity to the fact that unwanted children are going to be abused children, and therefore if they're unwanted, abort them so they aren't born and being unwanted become abused. By the way, studies show there's very little correlation between how much a child is wanted before birth and how much that child is wanted after birth. Furthermore, Dr. Lanoski, professor of pediatrics here at USC, showed that 91% of battered children were from planned pregnancies. Another study demonstrated more deviant behavior in wanted babies than in those who were unwanted. So any argument that an unwanted child becomes an abused child just doesn't stand up to any kind of test. On the contrary, there seems to be a correlation between abortion and child abuse. When abortion was legalized in the United States, there were 167,000 child abuse cases per year. It was legalized in 1973. By 1979, there were 711,000. In 1982, there were 1 million. Britain experienced a 10-fold increase in child abuse after liberalizing abortion laws. Now you ask, what's the correlation? The correlation is you begin to educate the whole society that a child is a non-person, not worth living, and shouldn't be any kind of intrusion into your world, and you begin to treat them that way. Professor of psychiatry Philip Ney concluded in a widely publicized study that the acceptance of violence against the unborn lowered the parents' resistance to violence against the born. That should be obvious. Abortion is often portrayed as benefiting women. Yet ironically, when decisions are made on the basis of sex, girls are aborted far more often than boys. Out of 8,000 amniocentesis, that is abortions done in Bombay, 7,999 of them were girls. One was a boy. This is true in China. They're only allowed to have one child, and if it's a girl, they kill it. In one study in the United States, 29 out of 46 girls were aborted. Only 1 out of 53 boys were aborted. So the idea that abortion benefits women doesn't seem to fit the facts. It winds up in the slaughter of women around the world. Some argue that abortion is necessary because of overpopulation, but that ignores principles of production and distribution. How in the world do abortions in the United States alleviate overpopulation in crowded parts of Africa? There's no correlation. Furthermore, the United States and Europe have a different population problem. The numbers being born are not replacing the aging and dying. I was told this morning by someone who works with the IRS that one of the formidable problems the IRS and Social Security is facing now is the fact that there are so many abortions, there's not going to be enough people born to pay your Social Security by the time you retire. So what they're doing now is, in a very few years, they're going to raise the Social Security level to 67, and some years after that, the plans are to raise it into the mid-70s. Why? Because there's no funding, because there aren't going to be enough wage earners to support us when we get old. Pro-abortionists argue that restricting abortions will return us to the era of back-alley butchers. Dr. Bernard Nathanson, who was one of those abortionists and converted over to a non-abortion position, replies that not only were deaths in the pre-Roe versus Wade days grossly inflated, in fact, he says they lied about how many deaths occurred in illegal abortions because they wanted abortion legalized for business reasons. So they fabricated all the figures to make people think that more people were dying than actually were in illegal abortions. But he went on to say, developments in medical technology and pharmacology will mean that even illegal abortions will be medically safe. Not that that's right, but they use that as an argument that if we ever stop legalizing abortion, non-legal abortions done in less than proper medical facilities and with less than proper medical means will result in many deaths. And he says